Olá, bom dia a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos ao Proformação. Nesta manhã de sexta-feira, teremos a alegria e a honra de receber aqui nesse nosso colóquio, Proformação em parceria com o GECAL, Universidade de Brasília, a presença do professor Hans de Wit. A nossa fala hoje é sobre um tópico extremamente interessante, especialmente quando nós consideramos o momento pós-pandemia, esse momento de alargamento das fronteiras, né, ou de rompimento das fronteiras. Internacionalização do ensino superior é o assunto sobre o qual nós vamos conversar hoje. Eu agradeço a todos pela presença, convidem seus colegas, enviem o nosso link. Teremos a honra de receber aqui as pessoas interessadas em conversar conosco. Durante a audiência, a gente vai receber as perguntas, compartilhar com o professor e fazer desse momento um momento de diálogo. Eu convido aqui para dividir esse espaço comigo, meu colega, meu grande colega de trabalho e de vida, Kleber Aparecido. Kleber representa o grupo GECAL. Deixa eu chamar o Kleber aqui. Olá, Kleber, seja bem-vindo. Kleber aqui fala em nome do grupo GECAL, Universidade de Brasília, nosso coordenador de pesquisa e de empreendimento na academia. O espaço é seu, Kleber.
Olá, Kátia, bom dia, ou boa tarde, ou boa noite, para quem está nos assistindo agora. Eu queria agradecer muito o Proformação pela parceria que nós já temos, de vários eventos voltados para a área da linguística aplicada à crítica, educação linguística crítica, e queria agradecer muitíssimo a oportunidade de estar nesse momento representando o nosso grupo de pesquisa, o GECAL, Grupo de Estudos Críticos e Avançados em Linguagem. Gostaria de saudar tanto a professora Kátia, quanto o nosso ilustre convidado, o professor Hans de Wit, juntamente com os mediadores Tamara e Laura, que nos irá conduzir os trabalhos nessa manhã. Desejo a todos um ótimo evento e certamente ter a presença do professor Hans de Wit, que é uma referência na área de internacionalização, irá contribuir muito para o nosso crescimento acadêmico profissional. Então sejam todos bem-vindos e sintam-se todos abraçados de uma forma muito carinhosa por mim.
Ótimo, obrigada, Kleber. Gostaria que, antes de dar início à nossa fala oficialmente, convidar vocês a nos prestigiar nos próximos meses. Todos os meses estamos aqui, realizando o nosso colóquio. Ao final dessa programação, você vai conhecer a agenda da próximo encontro, a próxima conversa. Também fique conosco durante esse evento para participar ativamente e contribuir com as suas questões, ok? Proformação é um canal criado, sou eu, professora Kátia Martins, com o objetivo de alargar as possibilidades de diálogo com professores em formação, professores em exercício. E por nenhuma outra razão seria mais especial ter essa parceria com o meu colega Kleber para trazer nesse espaço muitas contribuições fora do Brasil e dentro do Brasil também, que possam alargar o nosso diálogo, que possam ampliar as nossas reflexões, ok? Hoje nós vamos ter um diálogo em língua inglesa. Nossos mediadores, Laura e Tamara, farão as perguntas e apresentarão as perguntas também em língua portuguesa para contribuir com a nossa audiência. Depois vocês poderão acessar o recurso da legenda, caso precisem acompanhar com a legenda quando esse vídeo for baixado no YouTube, não simultaneamente. Poderão postar perguntas em português e em inglês, sintam-se à vontade para interagir em língua inglesa ou em língua portuguesa. Nossos colaboradores, nossos mediadores irão fazer a tradução quando necessário. Tenham uma excelente manhã, eu e Kleber ficaremos aqui nos bastidores e já voltamos para vê-los novamente. Convido Lauro e Tamara.
Olá, pessoal. Bom dia a todos aqui no Brasil e boa tarde ou boa noite para quem nos assiste em outras partes do mundo. Para mim é uma honra participar como mediador deste colóquio sobre internacionalização da educação. Eu gostaria agora de convidar a professora Tamara Rosa para cumprimentar a audiência. Por favor, professora Tamara.
Bom dia a todos, né? Boa tarde, boa noite para quem nos assiste de outros lugares. É um prazer imenso poder participar desse momento. Como eu já havia colocado em conversa informal, nós, pesquisadores do GECAL, temos a honra de ter um professor o qual nós estudamos, debatemos antes deste colóquio. Então, esse colóquio vem a concretizar os nossos debates e assim esperamos que vocês também possam participar desse debate juntamente conosco hoje. Então, hoje o tema do nosso colóquio é Internationalization in Higher Education, from Western Paradigm to an Inclusive and Equal Global Concept, Challenges and Opportunities. Antes de continuarmos, eu gostaria de convidá-los a acessar o QR Code que fica aparecendo em nossa tela, para que vocês possam conhecer um pouco mais do trabalho, do Proformação, do Grupo GECAL, o NB também, porque a gente tem focado em temas como educação linguística crítica, formação de professores, letramentos, políticas linguísticas, internacionalização, para mencionarmos alguns aqui, né? Estudamos outros tópicos também, mas o nosso debate hoje está focado na internacionalização do ensino superior. Então, agora passo a palavra ao professor Lauro para continuar os trabalhos de hoje.
Obrigado, professora Tamara. A partir de agora, eu vou passar a me comunicar em língua inglesa, então eu gostaria de pedir licença à audiência para a gente proceder em língua inglesa, tendo em vista que essa é a língua falada pelo nosso convidado de hoje. Well, so our today's speaker is a distinguished emeritus professor that studies the internationalization of higher education and how it can work as a key action for social development. Since I began my studies on internationalization of higher education formally because of my PhD application, few papers, chapters, and books whose references didn't mention a work by Professor de Wit. Few were these papers, few were these books. Besides having a massive academic production, Professor Hans de Wit has been awarded by many international associations. Not only because of that, but mainly because of the power and significance of his ideas. Listening to him today is going to be worthy to all of us. Here to discuss the challenging future agenda of the internationalization of higher education and how it can be more inclusive and sustainable for society, please welcome Dr. Hans de Wit.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you all your colleagues for inviting me for this colloquium. I'm looking very much forward to have this interaction with Brazilian colleagues and maybe colleagues from elsewhere who participate in this colloquium about internationalization of higher education and moving from a more Western paradigm to a much more global, inclusive, and sustainable process. I think that topic is very urgent. Not only it was already before we entered in the two major crises that we face at the moment, the COVID pandemic, but also now the tensions in Ukraine and the whole geopolitical tensions that we are facing, that we have to see, well, how are we as institutions of higher education keeping our global engagement alive and making it much more important for improving the inclusiveness and sustainability of what we are doing, because there is a challenge that we will be much more going back to the old times of the Cold War and the division between the Western world, the bloc of China and Russia and some colleagues, and then the non-alignment world of which Brazil has always been a part. I think it's very important that we discuss these kind of topics of what does it mean for our work, what does it mean for internationalization. So I'm looking very much forward to talking with you about it. And it's always been a pleasure for me to talk with my colleagues in Latin America. I have a long alignment with Latin America. I've been as a student in Peru studying for my master thesis, and I've been working in almost all countries in Latin America on internationalization of higher education. So it's always a pleasure to be there, and in particular also a pleasure to be in Brazil. So looking very much forward to this dialogue and conversation about internationalization of higher education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hans. Please, Professor Tamara.
De Wit. Before we proceed to the questions previously prepared for you by members of our research group, could you present a quick overview of your studies on internationalization over these years?
Yeah, thank you. That's nearly talking about 40 years of experience in internationalization of higher education. So that's on the one hand very long, but also a very enriching experience, because I've seen internationalization develop in many different directions. And when I started, it was more as a practitioner. I was director of international relations, first at Tilburg University and then at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And when I was doing that work, and it came from a background of being a Latin American studies academic, most of the work on internationalization of higher education around that time, and we're talking about the late 1970s, was focused much more on capacity cooperation with developing countries, including Latin America. So there was not really an internationalization strategy of universities, much more that the governments in the Netherlands, but also in Sweden, Canada, etc., provided funding to universities to help universities in developing countries and emerging countries to create much more capacity and scholarships for students and professors, and sending infrastructure and doing research capacity. So that was my first experience with internationalization, was much more in the development cooperation area. Then in the 80s, it came to us that the European Commission started to develop exchange programs like the Erasmus program, and also language programs to improve the language capacity and internship capacity. And so the universities in Europe were basically stimulated by the European Commission to develop an internationalization policy and activity. And we didn't know how to do that because we had no experience with that. We only had the American experience, and we knew a little bit about that, but it was so completely different that we had to develop our own approach to internationalization. And since we didn't want to invent the wheel, each of us ourselves, I and a small group of colleagues from international offices in Europe decided, why don't we create an association? Why don't we create a professional organization of people working in the field of international education to do capacity building among ourselves, to train each other, to learn from each other, to do advocacy, etc. So in 1989, in Amsterdam was created the European Association for International Education, which is the sister organization of NAFSA in the United States and FOBAI in Brazil and AMPE, etc. And that still is, after NAFSA, the largest organization in the world of international education officers. So that was my first experience. Say, well, I can think about what internationalization means in my institution myself, but I can also learn from others. And then I started also to look into what has been written about internationalization of higher education. And there was no real scholarly kind of foundation for that. There was very little documents and articles and books written about international, what they called at that time, international education. So I started to work on it myself, and then came in contact with my colleague Jay Knight from the at that time Ryerson University in Canada, who also had just finished her PhD on international education. And so we started to talk to each other and thought about publishing together. And that resulted also on the request of the Organization of Economic Cooperation, the OECD, to write a book. So in 1995, we wrote a book, the first book about internationalization of higher education as a concept and as a strategy, comparing what internationalization means in Europe, in the UK, in Australia, and in the United States and Canada. And that was for the first time that there was a kind of idea about what do we mean with internationalization? How do we define internationalization? What are the rationales for internationalization? What are the different strategies that there are there? And can you see a difference between the United States, Europe, and Australia? Because in Australia and the UK in particular, internationalization was basically recruitment of international students for revenue generation, making money, which was established under the Thatcher regime in the UK, moving away from the old concept of scholarships to international students, and say, well, no, international students can come to the UK and you have to pay tuition fees, and that tuition fees is used by the higher education sector to develop itself. And that was quite different than the concept in continental Europe, which was still in development, but it was mainly focusing on exchange of students. Exchange of students for a semester or a year. And so not to have a full degree mobility program, but just a semester program or a year program, and you get then your credits transferred to your home institution. And in the United States, you had something similar like the exchange, but it was much more study abroad by groups of students. So in Europe, it was much more, Erasmus was individual. One student goes to another university and studies there for a semester, where in the United States, it was much more undergraduate students going as a group of students to Florence in Italy or Spain or etc. So there were already very different concepts, and Canada around that time was still basically capacity building. So we had to understand that internationalization meant something completely different in different contexts, influenced by political, economic reasons, academic reasons, social and cultural reasons, but a great variety. And although we saw during the 1990s a gradual shift in the direction of what already was the case in the UK and Australia to a kind of more neoliberal market-oriented approach, that was going very gradually. And in continental Europe and the United States, it was still mainly cooperation and not competition. But still, we saw a paradigm shift in internationalization from being much more on cooperation, exchange of students, exchange of scholars, joint curriculum development. We saw increasingly much more a competitive environment of internationalization. We compete for students, we compete for professors, we compete for positions in rankings, we compete for access to publications in top journals, etc. That became much more dominant in the late 90s, the first 2 decades of this century, as the driving force for internationalization. And in reaction to that, then several people said, well, this focus on only exclusively mobility is wrong. It's elitist because it's only approaching a very small number of students and professors and institutions that benefit from this approach, neoliberal approach to internationalization. So then you got in Europe the movement internationalization at home. We said, well, we talk about mobility, but what about the 95% around that time that is not mobile? How can we give them learning outcomes that are much more international and intercultural? How can we prepare them to become professionals? And in Australia and the UK, there was a movement for internationalization of the curriculum to say, well, if we have all those international students coming, how can we give them the right education so when they go back that they have much more use of it, instead of that they are completely trained to become Western academics and Western professionals. So that was an important movement that happened, although and there was quite a long positive reaction to those movements, but mainly in words, not in action. Not as much happened still, because still the dominance is internationalization, is what Jay Knight calls internationalization abroad. Mobility of students, mobility of faculty, and mobility of programs. And that was the whole tension to make that agenda different has been a key factor in the past decades. Then we also said, and partly influenced by the pandemic, but already before, universities have three missions: research, education, and service to society. But internationalization is only focused on the first two, but not on the society. Where at the same time, that third mission of service to society is very important. And we see that our world is confronted with a lot of challenges, poverty, health, climate, all the sustainable development goals. So also the focus on society and internationalization became then an issue that we said, well, it's very important to address as well. And that resulted also in a kind of different form of defining internationalization. The definition, which was quite common until 2015, was the definition by Jay Knight of internationalization is the process of including international, intercultural, and global dimensions in the purpose, delivery, and objectives of post-secondary education. It was a very clear but very broad kind of working definition, which could mean anything for everybody in their own interest. And we said in 2015, based on a study that we did for European Parliament and asking experts from all around the world, is this the definition that we need for the future? So we then decided to say, well, the definition, the basis of the definition is still fine, but it has to be an intentional process. That process doesn't go by itself. It has to be done really by purpose by the different stakeholders in higher education: governments, leadership of institutions, students, faculty, the surrounding society, private sector, etc. So it has to be intentional. It's also not internationalization as a goal in itself, but it's a means to enhance the quality of what we are doing: education and research and service to society. It also has to be not elitist, but it has to be inclusive. So it has to be for all students and all faculty, and it has to make a meaningful contribution to society. So it has to be really helping society to solve the problems that we have. So that definition in 2015 was really a kind of change of focus from a much more, what I call, instrumental approach to internationalization and a mobility focus process of internationalization, focused on numbers, how many agreements you sign as an institution, how many international students you have, how many students do you send abroad, how many visiting professors do you have, how many positions do you have on the rankings, how many publications you have, etc. All fine, but it doesn't say anything about the quality of what we're doing. So the shift had to be much more on the quality, and the shift has to be that it is not only about mobility for a small group of people. Worldwide, we talk about something like 2%, but it has to be for all students and all faculty and all administrators in an institution of higher education, and it has to be for the problems of society. That was a fundamental shift, and I think the pandemic and the current geopolitical context has made that even much more necessary, that we really have to say internationalization doesn't go by itself, doesn't be an elitist focus, but has to be inclusive and has to be for all. So that's, in essence, the development that internationalization has made over those 40 years, from being what I call fragmented, marginal, and ad hoc, to a much more comprehensive approach to internationalization, which addresses all the three missions of the institution and which is inclusive for all the people. And that process of 40 years has been fascinating, and we still don't know, and we probably will discuss that, what will be the future. But I've learned a lot from learning and listening to others, talking with people, getting the different backgrounds, etc., to perceive that. And so the last point, and that's basically the topic that we are going to discuss today, is also that we encountered much more a clear idea when we were talking with colleagues from Latin America, from Africa, and from Asia, that internationalization was perceived, and correctly, I think, as a Western paradigm, as something dominated and defined and controlled by the higher education sector in the Western world, in North America, Australia, and Europe. And so that we should listen much more to what does internationalization mean in the context of the global South. How can we break the pattern of dominance? How can we make it much more inclusive and also adapted to your context? And that is a process that I think implicitly in my work I've been working on already. In the books that we published in the 1990s, we had actively involvement of scholars from Latin America, from Africa and Asia. And I've been working with a lot of colleagues like in Latin America, for instance, with Jocelyn Casal-Avila from Universidad de Guadalajara and others on this topic. But it has become much more dominant, I think, over the past 10 years by an emerging group of young scholars and rising scholars from those regions that really challenge us to say, well, decolonization is very important. Inclusiveness is very important. Identity issues are very important. And that are issues that are related to our context and not the context and the needs and the dominance of others. So that's a very important recent development, which was necessary, but came much more to the forefront also in the whole societal discussions about racism, nationalism, Western dominance in general, etc. So I think we responded to that and are still in the process to find the right way how to further respond. And that's much more your talk, because I can talk about it, but I think it's much more important that the scholars from Latin America, from Africa and Asia talk about it, from indigenous groups talk about it, than a white Western scholar can talk about it. I can only say it's important and you have to do that, and I can support it, but I cannot be the voice for you. You have to be your own voice, but that's a very important topic as well. So maybe that is a kind of first introductory overview of my own development and thinking about internationalization and how I try to listen to what others say and what others think is important and make that inclusive. So that's also why most of my work, as you can see, is not my own work alone, but I try as much as possible to collaborate with authors from different backgrounds and different perspectives. So because I think it's important that we talk together and we don't talk about each other, but we talk together. And so that has been very instrumental in my work as a practitioner, but also as a scholar, first in Europe and then in Boston College at the Center for International Higher Education, which also is quite different than most of the research centers in the United States. They talk about how great American higher education is, but we in the center, and my predecessor, Philip Albach as well, has always said, no, we have to talk about international higher education through the voices from those regions. And so we always have collaborated with scholars from all around the world, and that we will continue to do. So I will stop here and then we can continue. Thank you. Do you want me to respond to the questions that are in the chat, or?
Well, I think Professor Tamara is going to make some comments.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. I'm very happy because of this point of view about South Global, because we are starting studies from 10 years, but your view about North, about South Global is important for research, because our voice, the colonial perspective, the critical perspective, is important. This discussion about my view, your view, our view about this concept, internationalization. And here we discuss about this concept in a perspective more flexible, flexible in the sense of we have minorities, we have several problems, because mobility is the first point for many universities. Rankings is so far, because North is on the top, and we have different language policies, we have different perspectives, and this discussion, these words is coming about our view. And it's great because we are starting a new discussion in group, and we feel it's so important for us. Thank you for these words. Now we pass my turn for Laura, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Tamara. Thank you, Professor Hans. I think your ideas are always great. It's a great pleasure to hear from these words from you, and we truly appreciate them. And now we are supposed to begin commenting on the questions our research group has come up with. Okay? So we are familiar with the great definition you developed for internationalization. And I think this definition is on the screen. And then in 2015, you wrote, the international process of integrating an international, intercultural, or global dimension into the purpose, function, and delivery of post-secondary education in order to enhance the quality of education and research for all students and staff, and to make a meaningful contribution to society. So we wrote that in collaboration with other researchers. So Professor Hans de Wit, our research group from the University of Brasilia has elaborated a word cloud with some words related to the internationalization. And I think we are showing this word cloud right now. And taking this definition I just mentioned, we note that it has evolved over the years, especially because of the geopolitical implications on education worldwide. Would it be necessary to redefine internationalization considering the global scenario nowadays? We have the COVID-19 pandemic, we have issues related to war, and etc. We have the global commons. You know, I would like you to please comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm always a little bit reluctant to constantly change like definitions. So the definitions have to be broad enough to cover all kinds of contexts. Although, as I said, we extended the definition in 2015 from J. Knight's one, which was from 2003, and basically already from 1995, to much more than criticizing that definition, is to give it much more direction. And it's certainly true, and I referred already to that the current situation will have an enormous impact on what we are doing in internationalization. That's absolutely sure. I mean, we're not only talking about the pandemic and about the war in Ukraine, but we also talk about rising nationalism and populism, as you also see in Brazil. We see increasing debate about racism in society and in higher education. We see increasing inequality, and both the pandemic and the war will even extend that inequality in access to higher education and between higher education systems and institutions around the world. So we face enormous amount of challenges, and they all seem to come together around this time. They were there before. I mean, there were other pandemics before, like SARS, etc. There were other wars before. There was racism everywhere. There was nationalism, etc., etc. But they have been all accumulating in the past 2 or 3 years, and that has an enormous impact on society, on the economic situation, on the political instability around the world, and it certainly has an enormous impact on higher education. So it will also impact internationalization, because internationalization is very much related to international context and interculturality. So I'm not a very, in that sense, short-term optimistic person to say, well, we will be able to continue with our global engagement around the world that easy as it was before, because there will be much more an inward-looking tendency into geopolitical bubbles like the industrialized world and China and Russia and so on. And that will make us going back basically to the old times of the Cold War, where it was also difficult to engage with the rest of the world. And so that's sad, but we at the same time, the context has changed because there are many factors that influence it. We didn't have social media around the time. Communication was much more complex. We didn't have the possibility to use the technology for digitalization. So it is interesting that we can see, well, how can we also use these crises as an opportunity? We always say, well, crises are disastrous, but at the same time, crises can also open up new opportunities. And that's what we have to look into. What are those opportunities that we see? One of the big opportunities that I see is the whole aspect of digitalization. The fact that we can have this colloquium online is in itself a very positive development, because in the past I would have to travel all the way from Amsterdam to Brazil, and which is in itself nothing wrong with. I have always done that with pleasure. But at the same time, it costs enormous time, it costs energy, it costs, so it affects the environment. And also, I can reach fewer people, because now online you can reach much more people at the same time from around Brazil and from around Latin America and from around the world. So there are opportunities there that we should use to both in the professional development, the capacity building process, so that we can learn from each other much easier in workshops, colloquia, seminars, etc., webinars, to reach each other. We can also do it in the curriculum. We can use collaborative online international learning. We can use the possibilities of technology that students and faculty around the world meet each other online, and also by social media to talk with each other, to exchange ideas, to do joint assignments, etc. So that is an opportunity which already before the crisis of 2020 was there, but we didn't use it so much. It was very marginal. Now we were forced by the pandemic to go everybody online, and it was not a big success because people had all kinds of problems, mental health problems and frustrations, and not access to technology, etc. But still, we learned how to use technology also in a positive way. And if we try to do that and continue to use that experience as an added value to higher education and to internationalization, then I think that's a very positive development, because that creates much more possibilities for interaction and communication. Will that be possible? Certainly, for instance, now it will be impossible to have this kind of conversations with Russia. It's getting increasingly more complex to do it with China. And people cannot talk freely and so on. So there are positive sides, there are negative sides, but certainly internationalization will change because of that, and we will have to see where it goes. We cannot predict what the future will be, because there's so many uncertainties at the moment, which have not been there for a long time. Even in the previous Cold War, things were much more stable, and now it's so uncertain what will be the next step, that we don't know. But we should at least look into how can we contribute to make the world better than it is currently the case. But does that have an impact on the definition of internationalization, how we define it? I don't think so. I mean, the topics that we have been discussing before about decolonization and shifting the paradigm from a Western paradigm to a much more inclusive and sustainable paradigm are part of the definition. The main problem is that the intention to do that is not always there. I certainly can say that what I also see in a lot of Latin American countries is that there is still a tendency to be copying what we do in the industrialized world. So still focusing too much on mobility, too much focusing on rankings, too much focusing on teaching in English, all those kind of things that are much more like copying the strength of what we were doing in the Western world, instead of thinking about, but what does internationalization mean in our context? How can we increase more South-South cooperation? And how can we increase much more in higher education space in Latin America and work together with our colleagues in other parts of Latin America? Instead of just thinking we have to look at Europe or we have to think at North America. That kind of intention has to be there. And that's something that leadership has to show, that they really want to make a difference. And I don't see yet enough of that kind of intention to make higher education in countries like Brazil inclusive and sustainable. They're still looking into how can we collaborate with North America and with Europe. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if that's the main only direction, then it is too limited and it doesn't help you to create your own identity in internationalization.
Well, that's amazing, Professor de Wit. And that reminds me of the idea of how coloniality and modernity constrain internationalization actions, and I think also globalization has a profound role in that, constrictions existing in internationalization. And as you said in one of your texts and papers, internationalization should always be local based or take into consideration contextual realities. So, and I totally agree with that, because some actions that work in the global north, most of the times it doesn't work and it's not adequate, or it doesn't generate profitable, results in the global south. So I think context is always important when we think about implementing and developing internationalization actions. But globalization and modernity paradigm is always there. and Western paradigm, which comes related to globalization and coloniality. And we need, I think, to create some tension on how do internationalization other ways. And I think we might also think about another internationalization possible. Or when we think about that book from Professor Milton Santos, for another globalization, I think we need to also think about another internationalization of higher education. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Professor, considering the latest updates in the internationalization concept, we would like to hear more from you about the role of internationalization for society as an intentional goal of the process. This word intentional, this mean for you? Intentional. What is this for you? Intentional goal of process. Would you speak more about this?
Yeah, so the two topics together, intentional and for society. Intentional, what we wanted to say with that is that the process of internationalization doesn't go by itself. You have to have, as stakeholders in higher education, the intention to make a difference, to make it happen. I always say there are 4 elements in internationalization processes. First of all, you have to ask yourself the question, why are we doing this? And that question can be quite different for a university in Brazil than for a university in Mexico or a university in the United States. If I compare, I'm working for the past 7 years now in Boston College, which is only 3 miles away from Harvard and MIT. But internationalization is completely different in Harvard and MIT than it is in Boston College. Boston College is not in the top 100 of the rankings. It's somewhere in the top 300. It's not a general university, but it's much more a Jesuit college. So they have to say why internationalization is important, has to deal with their position as being a Catholic and Jesuit research university. And that means that they have to say, well, how important is then the third mission for society for us? Because in Jesuit terms, we always talk about social justice and human values and so on, and service to community. So we also have to then to say, well, how can we partner with other Catholic research universities around the world to make that difference? Harvard and MIT are much more focused on postgraduate and research and top rankings positions and getting the best of the brightest of the world, etc. That's not possible in Boston College. So context is different. There's not one single model of internationalization that fits all. You always have to look at the context of the institution, the context of where you are, if you are in a big city or in a rural area, and the context of what is the private sector, what is the main sources of revenue for a region. Is that agriculture? Is it industry? Is it services, etc.? It's very important. The context of the country compared to other countries, that all plays an important role. So you have to ask yourself always why in our context we have to internationalize. And those answers define what you are going to do, what kind of programs, priorities, needs, objectives you're going to define. And based on that, then you can describe how are you going to do this? How do you organize those things? Set up an international office or integrating it into another unit, how much funding you want to address to it, etc. That's the next step. But you also have always to look into what is the impact of what we're doing. So what do we want to have as outcomes? if you don't do that, then internationalization becomes something which is ad hoc and marginal, and it doesn't really make a difference. But you want to make a difference. So, and increasingly that impact is what we call internationalization for society. We say, well, the impact can not only be that you graduate a student who becomes a good professional, or that you set up a research program that is very good for a private company, or that you set up an agreement that you do for an interest for specifically for a kind of department. You always have to look, well, how can we contribute to solving the problems of our society? And that always the local and the global go together. So there's no contradiction between local focus and globalization in a good way. If globalization is only be competitive and elitist, etc., then it's bad. But if you understand that the local problems can only be solved in a global context, climate change, health, etc. And we have seen with the pandemic how it is important that we work together to solve the problems, and we have not been always very successful in that, but at least there was a clear demonstration that it was necessary. So local and global are very much together, and that's what you have to analyze in your process. So what are the social needs that my specific institution in my region has to solve? And how can we learn by collaborating with others how to do that? What kind of best practices we can learn from others? And how can others at the same time learn from you how you solve your problem? So it's, again, a mutual process. It's not like what has been the dominance of the Western world, that we had the resources, we had the knowledge, we had the power, and then we worked to collaborate with universities in Latin America, but only on our terms and on our needs, but not taking into account that you have also needs, you have much more needs probably than they have, but also you can contribute very much. And that should be recognized, that you make a significant contribution. So also there, local and global is very much connected to each other. Service to society is so essential, given what we are facing today, that has to be the main focus of why we are internationalizing. And we have been completely ignoring that for a long time in our work, and we should be doing much more to make that as the key factor of global engagement and cooperation.
Yeah, I totally agree with these 4 questions. And the question of Danielle is the same theme. How can we change that focus by keeping the word intentional in the concept? You spoke about this. And I think that in South Global, we have one more question, one more problem. We have the question about language. The language is a question that we have to think about, because South Global English language only 5% is fluent, and English language is one of the language that is necessary for internationalization. What do you think about this question about language inferring in the South Global?
Yeah, the topic of language is very complicated, but at the same time very important topic. There has been this tendency to consider English as the lingua franca for the academic world, and that by itself is a clear manifestation of why internationalization is perceived as a Western paradigm, because it is dominated by the Anglo-Saxon environment, so North America, Australia, the UK, and Europe increasingly becoming English also the dominant second language of communication and interaction. And you have seen this trend, in particular in Europe, that many countries' higher education has been moving into English as an alternative option for teaching in English. and also in research. And English has become the dominant language in journals and in books and in conferences. And even we are now talking in English. So that's a reality, and it is not easy to change, because English is not only, but first of all, it's not the biggest language as first language, but it is certainly the second. A second language is the largest language in the world. So it makes it much more easier to communicate in English than you would if you have to communicate in different languages. But we have gone to an extreme in doing that. And by being so extremist, we also keep the dominance of Western higher education into place, and also an internationalization. So we have to, again, ask ourselves, why are you teaching in another language than your own language? And why is that important? And what language then is important as the next question? And how are you going to make that happen? And what is the impact if you do that? I always give the example of when I was in Colombia a few years ago. I was at a university at the border between Colombia and Ecuador, El Paso, in a very indigenous community which had a nice university. And the dean of the nursing school in that institution said to me, the accreditation agency of the Colombian government requires that all students in higher education have to have a level of B2, I think it was now B1, of English as a minimum. And we're struggling very much with that issue, because our students are don't have English as primary or secondary education, so they come into the university without any knowledge of English. Then we have to learn them English, but at the same time they have no way how to practice it. So we are struggling very much with that. It costs us an enormous amount of money. It costs us time and professors to teach in English, and the result is that nearly none students really accomplish that minimum level of B1 is, as you know, just a minimum level of English. And so why do we have to do that? And I said, that's a very good question. I think that's one of the problems in many countries, that this focus on English is so completely isolated from reality. 99% of the nurses that graduate from that nursing school are going to work in indigenous communities in Ecuador and Colombia. So for them, it's much more useful that they know indigenous languages, that they know about indigenous culture, than that they know about English, because they will never use the English. So that's, I think, again, on the one hand, the dominance of a Western paradigm, but also the fact that that dominance of that Western paradigm is infiltrated in the leadership of countries and governments and accreditation agencies, as that's the way you have to do it. I'm not saying that in some circumstances and some disciplines it might be useful to have English as a second language, but that, if, for instance, can be in international trade or in international law, but that's then for that discipline. But to make a generic decision that English is this language of communication that we need to have is impossible, in particular because it's not possible for students to learn it. The way you learn a language, I mean, I speak 5 languages and I got 3 of them at school, but the way I learned the language is because in Europe, it's a small world. So if I have to use German, I can step on my bike and I go to Germany and I meet people and I talk with people. If I go to France, I take the train and I will be in 3 hours in France and I can speak with people. Or I can watch television in German or in French. I learned Spanish by going to Peru for my study in 1975, and I learned Spanish there. So I can practice it, because that's if a student has to learn something, as you know, without able to be practicing constantly, it is a waste of time and energy, and it is only frustration. So if you are not able to do that, forget about it. Either you have to have a system where you have sufficient quality in primary and secondary education to prepare students to learn a foreign language, then it doesn't make any sense for a university to invest a lot in it. So it is, I saw some question about internationalization of basic education. We sometimes as universities have to solve the problems that are really the problems of primary and secondary education and society, and we cannot do that. So the focus on English, in my view, is too extreme. All the languages are increasingly important. Spanish is very important. Portuguese is very important. Chinese is very important. Arabic is very important. And so we have to break that pattern that only English is the way to move forward, because it will not be effective. It will not work for most of the students that are in our higher education system. And it's also not needed. And it only strengthens this Western paradigm.
Great. Move on, Lauro, please.
Okay, thank you, Tamara. Well, let's move on then. Professor de Wit, some educational researchers note that most global North higher education institutions are for-profit. Is it possible to say that internationalization in the global South has been less impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic due to its cooperative online interactions and network? And we have another question in this question. What is the role of technology tools and resources for educational internationalization? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there are three dimensions in this question. First of all is the for-profit versus public. I think that the irony here says that most global North higher education institutions are for-profit. That's the reality. That's not the case. I mean, I would not ignore the fact that many of them have been revenue generating, but they are not for-profit. I mean, the private sector in the United States are mainly non-for-profit. There's also a for-profit sector, but that's a very low-end sector and small sector compared to not-for-profit. And in Europe, it's nearly non-existing, the for-profit one. Where in reality, in the global South, in particular in Latin America, but also in many parts of Asia, the private higher education sector is larger than the public sector, and many of them are for-profit. So that's in itself important to keep in mind, because the public sector in the global South has a tendency to be massive, big universities, but in its internationalization and in its positioning is very much postgraduate. So there's not so much happening there. Where at the private sector, it doesn't have a postgraduate sector, and so it's mainly focused on the undergraduate, and there you see more of a mobility type of happening, but also on a limited way because there's no incentive. But the second part is relevant in the sense it's possible to say that internationalization in the global South has indeed been more positively giving opportunities than in the global North. And why is that the case? As I've said before, if you have an internationalization strategy, which most countries have, which is exclusively focused on mobility, and then the reality is that most global South countries, in particular in Latin America, have only a very small percentage of students that go abroad, less than 2%, and have also a very small number of international students going to their universities. And if they are international students, it's mainly at the postgraduate level and from the region, from Latin America. So in that sense, the negative impact of the completely stop of mobility during the COVID-19 was less severe in the global south than it was in the global north, in the sense that you didn't have those international students. You didn't have so many students that go abroad, or it would have been for full degree programs, but we're talking here about short-term mobility. So using technology is an opportunity, because you discovered that you could use technology to have an interaction between students from your own universities and students abroad by the internet. So I think that that will be accelerating the positive dimension of international virtual exchange and virtual mobility in Latin America much more than it will be in the global north. Because what we see already in the global north, they're focusing back on mobility, physical mobility, in-person mobility. So they want to recruit international students again. They want to send their students abroad. And they don't use so much the technology. You will not do that. You cannot do that. You don't have, the students don't have the means to travel abroad. The international students are not wanting to go to Latin America, unfortunately, because they could learn a lot of it. I have been benefiting very much, and I know a lot of students, but still the perception is you don't have the quality to go there for full degrees. So if you don't have that, and you still want to internationalize, you have to use the technology to do that. And I see already a lot of very positive examples of institutions in Latin America that use collaborative online learning as an instrument to internationalize the curriculum and the teaching and learning process. So that's an enormous opportunity, and keep working on that. My view is also that the more you use this kind of experience, that you use technology to bring people together from different cultures and different nations, that also stimulates the in-person mobility. Because if a student has, during the pregrado, an experience online of meeting students and faculty from other countries, they might say at the postgraduate level, oh, that might be interesting. I want to go to that country, or I want to meet those students in person, etc. So it is something which I think you have to develop as a kind of also tool and instrument to stimulate internationalization and to take your disadvantage to an advantage in the future. And as Roberta says, Roberta Santos says, it is also much more inclusive as a result, because in using virtual mobility, you have much more students and professors who can benefit from that type of interaction than if you have to focus on the in-person mobility, because that will be elitist. That will be only for those who have the means to do that. So the number and the social impact of virtual exchange and virtual mobility, in my view, is enormous. And so I really think that you should focus on improving that possibility as much as you can.
Well, I think technology is absolutely an amazing opportunity to promote a more inclusive, a more sustainable internationalization, not only of higher education but education in general. And when we think on high school, for example, or vocational education, I think mainly for students and professors and teachers in Global South, and sometimes these people, they don't have, how to afford traveling or, participating in an international mobility program, which is becoming more and more expensive these days. So I think this is going to help. But in my opinion, according to Professor Henri Giroux, because Professor Henri Giroux in 2005 he wrote about the importance of, mobility for giving the opportunity for teachers becoming more, multicultural and transnational. And as you said in your text, I think in one of your papers, when you with Professor Elspeth Jones discuss inclusive internationalization, you say internationalization is important. Mobility is important, but it's not the synonym of internationalization. So it's possible we are not excluding mobility, but when it comes to context, for example, when you have COVID-19 pandemic, it's necessary to think on other possibilities besides mobility.
Yeah, no, and that's a very good point. I mean, that's exactly what we have to say. There's nothing wrong with mobility, and if it's possible to do that, please do it. But we know from experience that mobility is limited in possibilities, primarily for financial reasons, but also for all kinds of social reasons, your cat, your dog, your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. People are not really able and willing to go abroad. So by that, it will always be a small percentage. And if we focus our internationalization strategy on a very small percentage, in Europe, it's something like 20%, because we have this Erasmus program, and it's also much more easier to move from one country to the other. And so if you get a scholarship and you go to France or to Spain, that's fine. But in your case, it's only 1 to 2%. So if we think that our internationalization strategy is only focused on 1 to 2%, we exclude 99 to 98% of the student population and most of the faculty from having an international intercultural learning outcomes. And the reality is that everybody has to work in an international intercultural environment, and everybody as a citizens also has to be focused on that they are living in an international connected world. Even if you're going to work as this nurse in El Paso in an indigenous community, as a nurse with indigenous people in Ecuador, then still they can be confronted by COVID, which is an international virus. They can still need medical help from abroad. There might be still tourists or whoever who comes to visit and have to be helped by nurses. So everybody in every context has to understand what it does mean as a professional, but also as a citizen, to be interconnected with the rest of the world. So we have to make that possible for the 99% also. And if then one of those 90% of those 99% says, well, I want to have those basic international intercultural learning outcomes, but I want to be really somebody who wants to work abroad as a nurse for Médecins Sans Frontières, or want to go to live somewhere else, then you can help them, because then your strategy is only focused on that 1%. But if you then ignore the 99%, then you do something wrong. So that's why Betty Lisk and I call that global learning for all. So internationalization has to focus on global learning for all. That can include mobility, but should not be exclusively focused on mobility.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Now I invite Professor Tamara Rosa to move on.
Okay. Now we have another question. How have the demands of internationalization of higher education impacted K-12 education in general? How do you think about this topic?
Well, it's a very relevant topic, because as I already said when we talked about language, we cannot solve the problems that to prepare our students for being globally connected and as professionals and citizens. We have to start already in primary and secondary education. So primary and secondary education has to be also internationalized in the sense of what do we learn in the curriculum? How do we learn it? Can we do virtual exchanges in the curriculum? I see, for instance, in Europe, there's much more virtual exchange going on at the K-12 level than in the higher education level, because it's nearly impossible to move around, and but you can still have children talk with children in other contexts and learn the language and the culture by doing that. So I think K-12 education, internationalization is as important, maybe even more important than higher education, because we also know that the more children are prepared before they go to university, that they have been learning about international, intercultural, and global, that they also will want to do that in the higher education sector. So you have the need a constant line between the three levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary, and even continuing education when you talk about internationalization. And so language is one thing. So preparing already students to learn another language has to start in primary education, and otherwise it doesn't make any sense. But also geography, history, and then the intercultural communication part has to be at all levels, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. It implies also that teacher education, internationalization at the universities is very important. Because if we don't prepare the teachers to think interculturally and internationally, then it will not happen. So the more we invest in good quality international teacher education, the better also we can prepare our children in K-12 to be much more interculturally competent and internationally having good learning outcomes. So I think the line between those three is very essential. And it's still in the very early stages in many countries, but and it only happens in what we call international schools, which are very elitist schools, because that's more the rich people that send their children to bilingual schools or English schools or German schools. But that's again a very elitist approach. But most massive public primary and secondary education is not very much internationalized. So that's very essential as well.
Great. Juliana Jacinto is a research from Santa Catarina, South State of Brazil, and I had a great opportunity to participate of her work, and she spoke about internationalization in K-12, and we asked about how is possible one concept about internationalization in K-12. Do you agree with this? It is a one concept about internationalization in K-12, or internationalization is the same concept from all stages?
No, I think it's indeed, as I said before, you have to contextualize everything. So internationalization in K-12 has a different kind of focus than in higher education. It needs to be much more setting the basics. So again, why is it important to internationalize K-12 in the context of Brazil, for instance, is quite different than why we have to internationalize higher education. So you always have to go back to the basic questions. Why are we doing this? And then what can we do? And what kind of outcome do we want? What kind of implications it has for students? Do we want them to go abroad after the K-12, or do we want them to be much more prepared for a good higher quality higher education, or want to become a good professional. That is context-based again. So there are some overlap general maybe ideas about what internationalization is for higher education and K-12, but you always have to contextualize it. What do we mean in K-12? And I think in most cases that will be much more different than in the university.
Yes, Juliana used a concept from Paulo Freire. It's unprecedented viable, and she did the best practice in K-12 about internationalization. It's a great work that she wrote last month, and she spoke about this and mentioned your works too. Now, move on, Lauro, please.
Well, I'm really enjoying this conversation. I hope the audience is enjoying it too, because we are learning a lot, but we have to move on to the next question. And this next question is a little bit provocative, but that's okay. So let's go.
Yeah.
In Brazil, due to the current political economic crisis and the decrease in governmental investment in public education, international mobility has become impossible for many students from the public education institutions. An alternative for that would be the internationalization at home by the internationalization of the curriculum, for example. Professor de Wit, could you please comment on that issue? Please.
Thank you. Yeah. Of course, it's a fact that given the situation in Brazil, both politics and economics, the perspectives are very much minor than it was in the previous government with Science Without Borders, which created, and Language Without Borders, which was an investment in trying to internationalize higher education in Brazil. And although Science Without Borders had its deficiencies, and I've been debating that those deficiencies on those occasions very much. Still, it was a positive fact that the government was willing to invest in creating a much more critical mass of intercultural, internationally competent young generation. It was quite unique that the focus was particularly on that younger generation, and that there were plans to improve the programs and to make it much more adapted, and so the whole what was called print programs to improve much more the quality of the internationalization strategies in institutions, which was lacking when the Science Without Borders came there. So the universities were not prepared for how to make an effective use of that. But there was a plan to improve it, and then the current government has been basically canceling all kind of initiatives that were stimulating internationalization, and also it had a negative impact on the mobility possibilities for students because of financial needs. So it is indeed sad that that is the case, and it's not very optimistic to think that the economic situation will improve soon, given what we are facing in the world today. And so, yeah, the alternatives have to be focused much more on global learning for all by focusing on internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum. By the way, we use those two terms, internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum. I think that basically they are the same. There's a whole semantic debate about it by some of my friends and dear colleagues, Betty Lisk and Elspeth Jones and Jos Balen, about is there a difference between the two? It's my view that there is no fundamental differences. It goes about how can we improve the quality of the education such that the students have really in their content, in their learning outcomes, in their assessment of the learning outcomes, and in their the way how you teach, a much more possibility to be international, intercultural, and global. And if that goes with mobility or not, we have discussed that. I don't exclude mobility. Internationalization at home formally excludes mobility, so but I think that's not important. It's much more, how can we internationalize the curriculum, and how can we prepare our students that they really have a basic foundation of international, intercultural, and global learning outcomes that they can use when they graduate to work and to progress as academics, as professionals, or whatever. And I think that, and I've said it before, that's what is so important for Brazil and for other countries in the global south, that they focus much more on that as being the foundation for internationalization. The fact that over many years, internationalization was basically perceived as being mobility has to be changing into internationalization. Foundation is global learning for all and internationalization of the curriculum. And then mobility is one of the many instruments to do that, but not the only one and not the most dominant one. You have to focus on internationalization of the curriculum. And I also know that also in cooperation with Professor Betty Lisk and the Australian government, there's several initiatives in Brazil also to work very much about it. And I also see many colleagues in Brazil, but also, for instance, in Argentina and in Colombia and in Chile, working on this topic to make that much more the driving force for internationalization than just focusing on mobility. So there is an enormous opportunity, and there is, I think, also a much stronger inclination now in the current situation to do that than there was over the past decades.
Yeah, that's it. And I also would like to comment on your talk that when it comes to some very domestic realities in certain regions in Brazil, for example, the northern Minas Gerais region, for example, which is a kind of, it's a region that faces problems with lack of water, like dryness. The soil is very dry. It doesn't rain a lot. The climate is, hot, absolutely hot. Sometimes it's scorching. And for example, when I tell my story, I come from a reality when, for example, I never imagined that I could travel by plane, for example, because I don't know, 20 years ago, it was absolutely expensive and it doesn't make part of my reality. But education changed my life, and because of public education, I had the opportunity to be in touch with internationalization after I graduated on English teaching, and then I passed the contest, and then because of an international mobility program coming from the government, the federal government in 2015, I had the first opportunity to travel abroad, and this was for continuing education mobility program. And at that time, when we go back at that time in 2015 and 2003, we had a kind of modification. There was an attempt coming from the government to change the idea and some national attitudes, considering that inferiority people from the global south, specifically people from Brazil, have when they think about, we have to go abroad, we have to have this international mobility abroad because we need to learn with them. Yeah. Learn from them, not with them, because they have much to teach us. And there is this kind of inferiority idea coming from this national domestic context. And I think that, of course, from other actions besides mobility, it's absolutely possible to develop this problem, to try to deal with this problem. And I think we can get all of them, not only international mobility, but internationalization of the curriculum and other, like internationalization of teachers' education is also important. Internationalization via technological resources and carbon neutral actions for internationalization, as you said in your texts. Yeah. So I think we need to get all of these to try to demystify the idea. Most of the times, Brazilian students, or I don't know, teachers, professors might have on going abroad to learn from them and not with them. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry for taking too long.
Fine. No, that's fine.
Now I would like to call my colleague, to invite my colleague, Professor Tamara Rosa.
Okay. We have another question. In 2018, you and Professor Jones wrote, "Mobility may be important and necessary, but is insufficient to deliver inclusive internationalization. Could you please explain and give us some tangible examples of doing internationalization inclusive?" Once again.
And partly I've been addressing that already. It's as I said, especially in the global South, 8 to 99% of the students have not the possibility to be mobile. So that's not very inclusive if you have it as internationalization strategy that you only focus on that mobility. So how to make internationalization more inclusive? On the one hand, as I said, it could be by virtual exchange and virtual mobility or collaborative online international learning by using the internet, because then you can bring professors and students together online to discuss things and also to have joint assignment by students from different countries and professors working together to teach the course and to evaluate the assignments, etc. So that's a very important way. But there are other ways. I mean, you can also look much more at possibilities to bring internationalization at home in the community. So the students go to do internships with companies, international companies, that they're going to work with international communities in cities, that they are working in all kind of service learning projects for those communities, etc. That you collaborate much more with your regional partners. That you, if Brazil works with countries which are frontier countries, you have many of them. So the students in the north go to, let's say, Suriname or French Guiana, or that they go to Colombia, that they go to Uruguay in the south and Argentina in the south. And so that makes it much more easier to organize. And that's another way how you can make a much more regional approach to internationalization, because we still have a tendency to say, well, internationalization for your region is to go to Europe or North America. And that's not possible for many because of the financial consequences, because of the language, because of the time it takes, etc., and the resistance for that in the global north. So the South-South cooperation on the regional border is also a way how to do that. Most of the mobility in Europe also goes much more closer to neighboring countries than go far away, and that's that intercultural experience is also important. So look at setting up alliances and networks of universities in the region to make it much more possible for students and faculty to work together. then also you have a much more focus on the local needs of training and of research. So there are many ways how you can do that by thinking a little bit out of the box of what is internationalization normally is in the south, and that's going to the north.
Yes, this situation, we comment that in the pandemic context, virtual mobility, it's much more visible and possible, and this situation is like a global situation. Global situation is more possible and more discussions, and virtual mobility is the in Brazil we said like a mood of the moment, the star of the moment, to establish relations, not only mobility in other countries, but mobility of knowledge, teachers, many things. So move on, Laura, please.
Yes, thank you. I think we are getting back some topics because the topics they connect with themselves. But I think the next question is very important, because this is it. The internationalization of teachers' education has become an important action for the next phase of internationalization. You wrote that in 2020, and I particularly loved this text. Yeah, it's absolutely great. But however, in the internationalization of the Brazilian teachers' education, which is mainly through mobility programs from educational institutions, there are huge asymmetries among teachers at different levels of education. In your opinion, what are some of the approaches and methodologies that might help manage that? Please, could you explain a little bit?
Well, yeah, of course, the teacher education by mobility doesn't really make much of a difference. Also in Europe, teacher education is the less mobile of all the programs, because the idea is then, well, what do we learn from other teachers? Because the teaching is certainly in primary education is very local and very much focused on national needs. So first of all, you have to think differently about what the education in the K-12 is, as we discussed before. And then you have to look into how can we change the teacher education by, and in general, you can do it by virtual again. But it's a fact that the asymmetries among teachers at different level of education is not something unique for Brazil. That's happening everywhere. So you have again to look into what does it mean? Why are we doing this at this level of teacher education? And what are we doing? And what do we want to? What change do we want there? And think about it much more from a curriculum point of view than from a mobility point of view. So, what kind of curriculum a teacher has to teach at which level to be much more international, intercultural, I think is the starting point to make teacher education much more international. The reason why we said that it was so important is, as I mentioned before, it is teacher education really makes a difference in the sense of then you can internationalize the K-12, and that's why you have to work on it. But I've been trying to work with some colleagues on teacher education in Europe, and it is not very easy because there's this perception, which was also a perception by law and also in medicine for a long time, that they are so nationally defined that you don't need to internationalize, you cannot internationalize. And in law and medicine, you see already big changes in that respect, and teacher education will be necessary also to adapt to reality that we are interconnected, and that's most of the children these days are coming from a very diverse background, certainly in the European context. I mean, there's no class which is only white local children. They come from Africa, they come from Latin America, they come from Asia, and they come increasingly from, so I think in the Netherlands now we have 30,000 Ukrainian children in K-12 education which came in. So that implies that teachers have to be prepared for that. They have to learn what it means to be teaching in an international, intercultural classroom environment. So it's so essential that we do that, but don't do it by mobility programs. Do it by internationalizing the curriculum of teacher education and internationalizing the curriculum of K-12.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And that also reminds me of the CAP Sprint program that contemplated only 36 Brazilian institutions, higher education institutions. And if you think that there are, according to a website that I'm consulting right now from São Paulo state government in Brazil, there are 296 public higher education institutions and 2,552 private higher education institutions in Brazil. And when you consider that only 36 public institutions were contemplated in this program, this is something we need to think of. And this is something from which we need to think of in order to think other more inclusive possibilities coming from local actors of internationalization. In my dissertation thesis, I tried to defend that language teachers, not only language teachers, but specifically in my case, the English language teachers, they are actors of internationalization, but not that pervasive or excluding internationalization. I'm more including, I'm more collaborative, some kind of internationalization that is that takes into consideration local demands, and I think that's a possibility to try to thrive this issue, you know. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Professor Tamara again. We are almost finished. Please, Professor.
That's right. Now, other question. What do universities need to do support the internationalization process from a decolonial perspective? And this question is the same, Professor Ademar. Are the North scholars ready to accept the voice from the South and take into consideration the voice that arises from here?
Yeah, let me start with that question. It's difficult to talk in general terms about if they are willing to do that or not. I mean, there is still this little bit of arrogancy in the global North with respect to voices from the global South. I think at the same time, there is a much more understanding of the need to do so to listen to the voices of the global South. And I also think that the voices of the global South are much more present now than they were. So there's much more a push from the global South to say, well, hey, when you talk about, for instance, internationalization of higher education, we have also something important to say, and we have maybe we have even more important points to say. And I see that, particularly from Brazil and from some colleagues like Sean Stein, who's now in Columbia, the University of British Columbia in Canada, and others, and your colleague Katja Martins, etc. There are a lot of people also who work maybe now in the global North, but come from the global South, who influence by their presence there and by their debate and collaboration that we are forced to listen to the global South. And you have to have a positive attitude to that. And so that's why I said also I always invite people from the Global South to collaborate with me, because I can learn much more from them these days than that they can learn from me. And that's important, because that gives you a different perspective, it gives you a different view. And so it's important to have those voices be much more present. How can institutions do that? I mean, again, leadership is very important. So there's this pressure from scholars, but leadership has really to be clear about there has to be a different way. We have to define our own identity of what is a university, what is internationalization in the context of the Global South, in the context of our country, in the context of our local environment, and what can we do to change the colonial atmosphere. I mean, most universities, the language we discussed before, English is an example of that. Forget about English as being the dominant language. Don't take it automatically that you have to do that. Don't automatically use only American or European textbooks. Try to develop your own textbooks and try to develop own case studies of what your experiences are, and not only copying from the West. Think about your own history very clearly, and put it into perspective of what you learn from your own history differently than the way we have been describing your history. All those kind of things an institution has to do, and an institution has to prepare its faculty to be open to that. So there has to be a very strong top-down incentive to stimulate that, rewarding faculty to make that difference, and also accept that there are critical voices that challenge the mainstream leadership and the mainstream faculty. Accept that. That's important to have an open mind to change and to transformation and innovation. Otherwise, it will not happen, because, I mean, most faculty in higher education institutions in the Global South are trained in the North, so they bring that Western paradigm with them, and are not so easy to change. So the change has to come from the younger generation that is much more critical, much more aware about the challenges, and are not embedded in this dominance of Western paradigm still, because so be open to the young generation to make the changes, which is always difficult, because there's always a hierarchical inclination in higher education, like in every society. But be open to that. Let the younger generation challenge the older generation to make the changes, and to challenge the Western paradigm and the colonial perspective.
I agree. I think related to South and North global, the main question is not the best or worse than, but it's different. I think this idea is the main idea to discuss about this topic. Now, move on, Laura, please.
Okay, thank you again. Well, we are almost finishing this meeting, and before we start commenting on the questions or more questions from the audience, I would like to invite all of you to watch our next colloquium on May 20, 2022. The next guest speakers are Professors Fernanda Liberali and Professor Valkyria Montemor and Professor Brian Morgan. Okay, so you please take a look at this channel, which is Proformação, and then activate the channel, so you're going to know more about that. Professor de Wit, thank you very much for sharing your great ideas, your thoughts. They are always, I learn a lot. We learn a lot when we read your publications, when we watch the videos you make, your lectures. And now I would like to to pass to Professor Tamara Rosa, because she is going to, I think, bring some questions from the audience, because they share some questions on the live chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, show these questions. First question. How can articulate the themes about internationalization, teaching of English as a lingua franca, language franca, and the formation of teaching, attending necessities of BNCC? It's a document from Brazil, like a curriculum of Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there has to be a lot of pressure, because I mean, the national common curriculum, if that defines so much what you can learn and what you can teach, that is against anything which should be like academic freedom and autonomy of the institutions and for the teachers in particular, to say what is important. At the same time, you need to have some kind of common understanding of what are your basic foundations and indicators to what you have to learn by discipline in the curriculum. But then it is important that you put pressure on the government by your professional organizations to tell them, well, we want to internationalize the curriculum, and these are some of our recommendations how to do that, how to define much more that the curriculum is international, what is the role of language in that, what is the role of how can we prepare faculty to teach that. That's all what you have to discuss with the government and with the Ministry of Education in particular, to try to make those changes happen. It's not going to be an easy process. Those things take time. Internationalization curriculum you cannot do from one day to the other, because there's resistance of faculty. There is resistance of the national government curriculum. There's resistance of accreditation agencies. There is lack of funding. There's so much challenges that you have to be aware that it's not easy to do. So you have to create a kind of much more community of champions that are saying, well, we want to do this, and we invest time and energy in it, and we make steps, little steps, step by step, to change the curriculum, because it is, again, it's so complicated to do that, because there's so many resisting factors that try to stop you from doing that. It's different than by mobility. You can send a student on a plane and that's fine. But the curriculum change is always complicated. And if you want then to bring in the international dimension, that's even more complicated. So take time, work on it, put your pressure on it, work with your professional organizations and your disciplines, and try then to make that change.
Well, do we have another question?
Only participants, they are speaking great, talking, significant talking. It was amazing morning, much knowledge. Lauro, I think we finished this.
I think there are many comments on people thanking you and people saying that you are amazing, that it's great to hear from you, and I totally agree with that. And for example, Roberto Silva Santos is saying that congratulations to the group, which has been promoting this opportunity of internationalization. A nice lecture. And yeah, this is what we do in the GCAL group in partnership with Proformação, that is giving opportunities to people here from the specialists. And that's another way of doing inclusive internationalization, in my opinion. We have another question from Professor Ademar Soares, and he says, what a marvelous morning we had with you, Professor Hans. Thanks a lot for sharing your ideas and knowledge with us. I thought it was a question, but it's just a compliment. Thank you.
Thank you for all those compliments.
Yeah.
But I also I share the other ones in saying thank you also to the great organizers that you have been the moderators of this session. So it must be very inspiring and nice to do.
Yeah, and now I would like to invite Professor Kleber Silva, Professor Katia Martins to get back to the live room so we can finish this amazing, perfect colloquium. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to say just a few words. Thank you a lot. I'm absolutely glad to be in here in the backstage to learn a lot and to have opportunity to think this topic. This is important. And being a professor at York, here in the North, global size, this is a great opportunity to learn about ourselves, actually, because you watching yourself from another perspective, and you can learn how you can improve your knowledge or your contribution with these academic search. Thank you a lot, Professor Kleber.
It's no words, no comments about this conversation, Professor Hans de Wit. It's an honor for us to receive you virtually in our university. Of course, that your trajectory in the Boston College inspired us like a researcher in internationalization in higher school. I'm sure that short time you develop some academic partnership together. We learn with you today, and we continue to learn with you. I'm sure that it's necessary to have more Professor Hans de Wit in our universities, because you are in this moment are in the Netherlands, and you will invest your time to share your knowledge with us. Of course, that your trajectory in the Boston University inspired us like a researcher in Brazil. And this opportunity, I'd like to thank you, Lauro and Tamara, to moderate this colloquy. It was wonderful. I tried to find a word in the dictionary to describe this moment, but I didn't find it. It's impossible to find it. It's wonderful. Thank you, Professor Hans de Wit.
Thank you. And it was a great pleasure to do that. And good luck with all your great work that you're doing there.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Now, take a picture, please.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, one
Take a
picture.
picture of all.
Yeah, wonderful.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you, Professor.